Sure, so I'd like to start with the Drucker story since we're here. When I first went to get my PhD, which I did at the University of Pennsylvania, I took my first class in management. And the professor of that class instructed each of us in the course to read the entire work of a noted management thinker. And so people picked, different scholars to look at, and not knowing any better, I picked Peter Drucker. So I worked my way through, starting with concept of the corporation all the way through the others, and get to the final sort of output of this course. And the professor looks at me and he says, "Well, that all sounds terribly normative," which in academia is a really bad thing. It means you're not being theoretical enough and you're not taking things seriously. But it really influenced the way that I think about management issues. And yeah, I don't have any problem being normative. And I think part of what we're here to try to do is use theories to better understand how we need to behave. So that's one short story. Next short story is, if you think about the pace of technological change, just to put it in context, World War I was fought on horseback. World War II was fought with nuclear weapons. And I sometimes think we get so wrapped up in the changes that touch us every day that we don't really see the great sweep. So I think that's just something to bear in the back of our minds. With respect to what this all means for business, I think the quest for natural monopolies, which JC would argue is where business wants to go, is increasingly less attainable. In fact, I talk a lot about the fact that the strategic idea of a sustainable competitive advantage is under threat, and the advances of new technologies are among the things that drive that. And so what that means for us, I think, is a different way of different set of assumptions about what business is all about. And I'll touch on a couple, and then maybe we feed that into the discussion. So I think the first assumption that we make in business is that stability is the normal thing, and change is the weird thing. So, if you Google change management or look up some other search engine, you will find 2.1 million hits on that topic, because we're so ingrained with this idea that things are stable, and then there's some big punctuation, and then things settle down again, and we have stability. And so I think part of the skill of management is, how do I provide structure and certainty and confidence for people amidst the reality that change is ever present? So I think that's the first thing we need to really think about changing. Second thing is, as competitive advantages kind of come and go, I think we need to be better about signaling and acting on, I call it disengagement, when you have to pull resources out of something that's kind of going away and relocate those resources into something that is new. And this really reflects a very Druckerian view of how you manage power, how you manage for the long run of the corporation, because this is tough stuff. I mean, you take an existing business and say, you're going the way of all things, and I'm going to accelerate your progress in doing that. Very difficult. Third thing that I think is really a challenge is, how do you keep self-interest in the corporation from bringing it to its knees? So if you think about powerful people in any company, they're usually very identified with their business. In many organizations, the power and the control over resources are synonymous. So you have the people that run the big important businesses able to dictate where those resources go. And so it's very difficult to come up to somebody and say, well, this thing is, it's BlackBerry, or it's a Nokia handset, or whatever it is, it's going away. We need to take those resources and put it into something else. That's really hard. Then we get to innovation. And I think I would argue that we suffer from a pervasive pro-innovation bias. Like, everybody talks about innovation as it's wonderful and it's new. And yet if you think about in your own lives, the chaos that some kinds of innovation have wreaked upon your life. I mean, appliances now that used to last for 20 years now last for somewhere between 10 and 12. Cars that used to be, sort of changed in some way. So I think there's some innovations that are, to use Baumol's phrase, they're productive, they're unproductive, and some are destructive. And I think we need to think about that, even as we recognize that continuous innovation isn't optional if you want your organization to remain competitive. So I think that's kind of a big deal. I think this puts enormous strains on leadership. And the way I think about it is, you need to be more discovery driven. And so in the kind of classic management theory, right, you had your objectives and you managed to those objectives, and you were a good manager if you hit those objectives, and if you had exceptions. You remember the old phrase, management by exception? Well, today, management's all about exceptions. In fact, I would almost argue you need to be putting more time and attention on the exceptions than on whatever's running, smoothly. And so the idea of being discovery-driven is really, as new data come in, are we rapidly adapting and responding to our environment? And that's really different than the kind of command and control mantra that we've had for a long time. And finally, I think the last thing really does tie to the previous panel, and it has to do with how we're going to build careers in an information-intensive environment. And I really do think more and more organizations are going to create these conditions by adopting a far more project-oriented way of organizing. So we're going to see people signing up. Reid Hoffman calls this a tour of duty. We're going to sign up for a tour of duty. We're going to execute that. Hopefully we do it well. And then when it's done, we may have to rethink completely what we're doing. And so we're building a lot more flexibility into the very way we structure work. And that has hugely profound implications for things like talent, Who do you keep in your network? Porous organizational boundaries. Your innovations may come, as we heard in the previous panel, from collaborative relationships, not from some scientist in a lab cooking things up. So I think there's some very concrete things that we can look at that change when you have digitization and new technologies fundamentally changing the assumptions on which management has been built.
Mm-hmm. So, Rita, you talked about, these weren't your words, but the myth of stability that we feel. But, for probably a lot of us, certainly for me and our, the media industry was largely unchanged for decades.
Oh, yeah.
And, and now it's sort of, obviously been turned upside down. We're scrambling to figure out, how we want to end up on the other side. But I want to talk to you. So you talked about adopting, sort of discovery driven sort of strategies. Can you talk a little bit more about how, those of us who enjoyed a period that felt relatively stable compared to where we are now, how do we equip ourselves then for this new, rapidly changing?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's a terrific question. So here's the thing. Human beings are awful at two things that become problematic in this rapidly changing world. We're really bad about assumptions. We tend to forget the assumptions that we make, and those that we do make, we tend to turn immediately in our heads to facts without any basis in reality. And the second thing we're really bad at is operating under uncertainty. So if you take a normal group of people and you plop them in a situation where you say, we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes, your normal human tendency is to kind of freeze in the headlights and wait for what happens next. So I think part of the skill of leadership today is picking where you want to create stability and making it very clear where things are going to be changing. And when I study organizations that seem to be pretty good at this, that's kind of one of almost the key management skills. So what tends to be stable? There, I think, is strategy. You can't change your strategy every 15 minutes. It confuses people, and you'll never get it executed. Culture. So what do we fundamentally believe? What principles underlie our behavior? Core values. So if you read CEO letters from companies that have been very good at managing through transitions, in the first page, they'll all hit on, here are our core values, here are our core beliefs. But I think the difference is this isn't just the CEO letter, it's actually lived. And why that's important, I think, is as new technologies push decision authority to lower levels, not because anybody designed it that way, but because things are moving so fast you don't have time to work it up and down the hierarchy anymore. So you have to have people at a coalface level almost making the decisions, having common understandings of why we're here, what's in scope, what's out of scope. That kind of clarity is really important. So on the one hand, I think there's a tremendous demand and hunger for leaders to create pools of certainty almost. So from that pool of certainty, now you say, well, okay, what has to change? Where are we going to be investing in options? What's your next role going to be? What additional skills do you need to create so that you're not one of the, the clingers on to fate? And so the kind of building in that dynamism, even as you're building in certainty, I think that's the critical trick when things are moving really, really fast.
So at the beginning of the session, the beginning of the day, Joe Masciarello quoted Peter Drucker saying, the more profound the change, I'm paraphrasing here, the more executives should maintain continuity. Mm-hmm. Would you modify that?
I think that's probably a fair statement. But I think what happens is we get hooked on the wrong kind of continuity. So let me give an example. I'm working right now with a company in the oil and gas drilling business, and one of the things they're really, really good at is extracting, natural resources from very difficult places. But they have defined themselves as energy producers, and that with the new kinds of energy, have very little to do with solar or renewables or water energy. I mean, their capabilities are all about like crushing up rocks and taking minerals out of them. And so because they've defined themselves narrowly by industry, they're not opening their eyes to other places where those capabilities could be relevant. So I think the continuity you want to preserve is, what are our capabilities? What do we believe in? What's our core purpose? What are we really, really good at? What are we most proud of? That you want to keep continuous. Industry is almost, well, increasingly it's a less useful boundary for thinking about your strategy, in my view. I talk a lot about competing in arenas where you as a leader have to define the arena for your people. They have to know what they're supposed to achieve and where and how. So I think the continuity that you want is something that gives people confidence to move out from what they've been doing all along, but that doesn't define it in a way that makes no sense.
Can I just add a word? When a chief executive sits down at a laptop to type up a speech, and the laptop knows that he or she is giving a speech on management, it immediately types automatically, "We live in times of great change."
In the first paragraph.
Yeah, it's just the first sentence.
It's a macro.
Every single speech that every manager, every chief executive gives, except it's been going on for about 40 or 50 years. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Where, the curve might look like this, but the first differential of the curve looks like that, and the second differential of the curve looks like that. With all this obsession with change, we don't notice all the things that aren't changing. And you know what? Most things are not changing. Look around here. Look around the whole format here. And I'm not criticizing this as being old-fashioned. I'm saying this is how we run conventions, and it's how we always have, and maybe the screens are a bit different.
You and I dropped the tie.
And everyone else. Why is everybody but you and me wearing a tie in this room? Because we've always worn ties. That's the only reason. Can you imagine if we never wore ties and somebody proposed that we should now wear ties? Men would laugh this out of existence.
So Rita, I think you have to respond to that because I loved your book on the end of competitive advantage. There were people who said sort of what Henry's just saying, that come on, you look at any period and it feels like the pace of change has never been so rapid, it's never been so overwhelming, and they dig out quotes like this, and they're from 1840 or something.
Right.
But your point is that actually something more profound is happening, right?
Yeah, I would say yes. And I think something to bear in mind is the tendency of human beings to overestimate the impact of change in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. I mean, if I look at the internet, right, and he picked up a magazine article from 1994 or 1995 when the commercial internet really first became something that was a thing. Everybody was hysterical, right? We all had to have a website, and we were all, running around and investing in these .com companies, and Pets.com was going to take over the world, and so forth and so forth. And large companies were panicking. I mean, the merger of AOL and Time Warner is just an example. I mean, I would sit down with executives during that period, and they were like, what do we do? What's our internet strategy? And of course, in the short run, the bubble burst. A lot of people went, thank God that's over, back to business as usual. And yet today, every business is a social business. Every business is connected. All organizational boundaries are porous. So let's ask a question to the audience. How many of you have had a purchase influenced in some way by a review written by somebody you don't even know? Everyone in the room. You don't have the option to not be a social business. So while I would agree that institutional things like do we wear ties or not, and how do we meet in Congress centers, I mean, that's all stable, right? It's easier, right? Why reinvent everything every time you do anything? But the idea that everything that's happening in this room is simultaneously being connected with people who could be 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away, that's new. The fact that inputs from those people could be discussed by people in a panel here, that rapidity of the spread of knowledge, I really do think that's new. So I'm not a huge advocate for everything is always changing all the time, and we all should start with blank pieces of paper every morning because it's exhausting, frankly. We need a few frameworks to just simplify our lives so that we can focus on what really does need to change.
Okay. So Henry, you sort of teed this up. Why don't you talk about, what has technology done to management, positive or negative so far, and then we'll push into the future too.